All right, guys. Let's get started. So this is going to be the kind of intro, talk for our next period, which is 1607 to 1754. And I'm sure you guys know that 1607 to 1754 has to do with the beginning of English colonization with Jamestown, all the way through to the outbreak of the French and Indian War. So kind of like the last time, though this one's going to be a little longer. Let me go into depth about it. We'll talk a little bit about some of the major factors, terms, events, themes, all that. And yeah, this will be a good intro for you. So obviously, since we're starting with 1607, and really when the English begin to colonize in earnest, we have to talk a little bit about why the English were so successful. Remember, England was the last major colonial power that really started to work in terms of expanding into the Americas. So you would think, especially given how successful the Spanish had been, how much territory the Spanish and the French controlled, even the Dutch, who we don't really think of as like a major colonial power, like the Netherlands was pretty powerful back then. You know, it had a strong navy, a strong merchant economy. So why were the English able to kind of cut in on this action? And a lot of it has to do with their colonial model. Whereas all of the other groups, with the exception of the Dutch, kind of focused more on what I would call like plunder or exploitation, right? The Spanish were just trying to get as much gold as they could. They enslaved the native population. The French were involved in the fur trade, but didn't really focus on settlement. For the English, even their colonies that were proprietary, that were designed to make money, even those were at least settlement based. You know, the way that they were trying to make money primarily was through cash crops. So you had to set up, farming communities. So the fact that the English were the only group that really actively promoted sending people from Europe to the Americas allows them to make up for lost time, and then also allows them to ultimately overtake all of the other colonial powers and essentially dominate all of North America by the time we get to the end of the French and Indian War. So let's look at some of the factors and things that went into this colonization with England. There were a lot of, at least initially, I would split it into two different kind of categories. There were religious incentives, people escaping persecution, and then there were commercial incentives, people who were coming to the Americas to make themselves wealthy, to get rich. So when we look at those, we see that in both cases, the English government also sanctioned and assisted them. So having that government help is also important. And then the last big thing, which is more of just like a current event for the time period, remember in the 1590s, the Spanish Armada was defeated. That seems like a very specific thing, but it's actually really important for colonization because the Spanish lost so many ships when the Armada was defeated that allowed the British to very easily go back and forth to the Americas without having to commit its entire navy to protecting the English islands from the Spanish fleet. So it basically gives them a lot more resources to go out and begin to colonize. So let's get into to some of the colonies. Let's start with Jamestown. You know that Jamestown was founded by the London or the Virginia Company. And really, Jamestown, at least initially, looked like it was going to go the same way that Roanoke did. It was going to be a failure. The people who came over initially didn't know how to farm. They thought that they could get rich quick. They picked a terrible location. If you remember, Jamestown's located on a peninsula in a swamp. So you could be cut off by the Native Americans, and they could just wait you out while you got, killed by malaria and yellow fever and all the various kind of diseases that thrive in swampland. So we had very early on in Jamestown this almost colony collapse that sometimes is called the starving time, where they didn't have enough food, and a lot of the people from the first couple of boats to Jamestown did die. Ultimately, you had a couple of key figures who were able to help Jamestown survive initially. You had John Smith, you had Delaware, you had Dale, and you had Gates. And they are the guys who came in. They organized the colony. They started to attack the Powhatan Indians, which was the Native American tribe that was in the region that was really the main opposition to Jamestown. They started to establish real rigid kind of social and legal structures to ensure that everybody was working to make the colony survive. And ultimately, they got through that first kind of period. The thing that allowed Jamestown to thrive was the shift in strategy to attract new members. And what you saw was that the big way that this was done was initially through the headright system. If you remember, the headright system gave you land if you paid for people to come over. So if you came to the colony, you got 100 acres of land. And for every person you brought, you got at least another 100 acres of land initially. So if I'm a wealthy merchant in England and I go to Jamestown and I pay for 10 or 15 people, I have a plantation that's a couple thousand acres. That's a big deal. You could gain a lot of wealth very quickly. And especially early on, all the land was open. It wasn't like there was, only really poor farming soil or farming land left. So this attracts a lot of people early on. You saw they also started to adapt. They started to take Native American farming techniques. Probably the most important was they started to grow corn, and that became a substitute for wheat. So you didn't have famine anymore. You saw also the first really significant governor, William Berkeley. He basically runs the colony like a dictatorship, which, on the surface doesn't seem like a good thing. But during this early time, you could make an argument that having a dictatorial colonial governor was actually pretty good because it allowed him to stay organized. He grew very wealthy himself because of this, but it also allowed Jamestown to grow and really start to occupy most of Virginia. And at that point, it became really clear that the colony was not going to collapse. He in a lot of ways oversees the Jamestown and Virginia colony as a whole through the period of time where it becomes self-sufficient. Now, the first major challenge after the establishment of Jamestown is Bacon's Rebellion. I think this is a really important one. I think that you should know about Bacon's Rebellion pretty cold. All right. I could see them asking about Bacon's Rebellion. It's maybe the most significant event prior to the French and Indian War in colonial history. So by the time you get to the mid to late 1600s, you see that a lot of the land in Virginia, at least the good land for farming, has been claimed through the headright system. And a lot of the freed indentured servants started to push across the Appalachian Mountains. And you know that the Tidewater region, which is the coastal region, they placed a lot of restrictions on that because they didn't want to aggravate the Native Americans, and they also didn't want to have these new kind of frontier farmers threatening their power. Remember, land is the source of power at this point, so you needed to control a significant amount of land in order to have any sort of political authority. And basically, the population grew too big for the region, and what you see is that these frontier farmers, led by Bacon, lead a rebellion against the Tidewater gentry, the Tidewater nobles, and it becomes the first really major rebellion in the time period. And the rebellion is pretty powerful. The thing that really undermines the rebellion is that Bacon dies. He gets dysentery, and when you lose your leader, a lot of times the rebellion collapses. Now, the rebellion itself is obviously important because it shows class tensions. However, the result of the rebellion failing is much bigger and much more significant to the development of the colonies. And that is that from this point on, all of those southern planter colonies start to shift from using indentured servants to using slave labor. So in a lot of ways, Bacon's Rebellion is the beginning of the drive towards ultimately the race-based plantation slavery that we've come to identify the South with. So, if there's one thing you remember about Bacon's Rebellion, it should be that it starts to directly lead to the implementation of slave labor and the end of the indentured servant and headright system. Okay. Now, we know that the other major place where there was colonization going on in the early 1600s is in Massachusetts, right? First, you have the Plymouth colony, and then the Massachusetts Bay colony shortly after. The funny thing about these is these were actually supposed to be Virginia colonies too, in particular the Plymouth colony. Um, they had set out for Virginia, and they basically got lost in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Google Maps sent them in the wrong direction, and they end up landing in Massachusetts, um, and they settle. They land in Cape Cod specifically, and the thing that's kind of significant about this is before they actually land, they agree on a kind of precursor to a modern constitution. You know that they sign what's called the Mayflower Compact. And what this was a binding agreement between all of the members of that first group coming over, rules and regulations about how they would run the colony. So in a lot of ways, it's the first legal constitution of the colonial era. So it's one of those early documents that ultimately kind of creates a foundation that later becomes, the U.S. Declaration of Independence and Constitution. That the Plymouth colony was a little different from the Jamestown colony. The primary concern of the Plymouth colony was religious freedom, right? These were Puritans. They had been persecuted in England. Puritanism had fallen out of favor by this point. And so they were trying to escape religious freedom. And also you saw that the English monarchy wanted to get rid of them because they saw them as a political threat. They had a better relationship with Native Americans than the Jamestown colony. Though that being said, they ultimately were still going to destroy the Native Americans, just a little more indirect. The Native Americans in Massachusetts were primarily wiped out by smallpox, by European disease. So it was not necessarily intentional, right? And the Pilgrims, they weren't like the type of people who were given like smallpox-laden blankets to the Native Americans. I know that happens later in American history. I think it's fair to say that the Pilgrims, at least the Plymouth plantation, they genuinely didn't realize that they had spread it, at least initially. And these guys were led by William Bradford. Now, the other big Massachusetts colony was Massachusetts Bay. This one was led by John Winthrop. They were Puritans too, but they were Puritans who came over more for the merchant trade. They wanted to make money. So they were kind of a hybrid religious freedom, economic gain colony. Massachusetts Bay is important as well because it's the first time that you really see an organized effort. Think of Winthrop as kind of learning the lessons of Jamestown and Plymouth. He comes over with 1,000 people, families too. The idea is they're going to put roots down. They found Boston and they start to found other cities. They are a theocracy, all right? They don't have religious freedom. It is run by the Puritans. But they have, like I said, more of an economic motive to them. So it's not a coincidence that Massachusetts Bay, thrives pretty quickly because they have that economic motive as well. Now, while those are obviously the first two, we know that there are a lot of colonies. And so I just wanted to do kind of a brief overview of all of the colonies to give you a feel for some of the things that were kind of similar and different between them. So the Maryland colony is similar to Jamestown. It was a proprietary colony. This is the one that was founded by Lord Baltimore, hence the city. And while it did have an economic motive, the thing that makes Maryland unique, kind of the greatest hits list, if you got to compare and contrast of colonies, is that Maryland was founded for Catholics, for religious freedom, right? It wasn't a Catholic-only colony, but it was founded as a place where Catholics from England could go to escape persecution. They passed, when they founded it, the Act Concerning Religion, which granted religious toleration to all different Christians, both Catholic and Protestant. And this was one that ultimately, kind of became much like Jamestown. It was primarily economically and merchant based. When we move our way down to Georgia, Georgia, this is the prison colony, right? They sent debtors there. They sent people from English prisons, people in poverty in England. Remember, being in poverty could be seen as a crime at this point in history. It was founded by James Oglethorpe. And the idea was that if you built the colony in Georgia, that would protect the more prosperous colonies to the north from Spain. Remember, Spain controlled Florida at this time. Oglethorpe actually attempted at one point to conquer Florida, but he failed. So Georgia kind of remained a buffer colony. When we look at the Carolinas, we know that North and South Carolina were originally just one big colony. Just Carolina as a whole. It divides later on. Um, it was another proprietary colony. And one of the things that was kind of interesting about the Carolinas is that the guy who founded it, his name was the Earl of Shaftesbury. He actually directly communicated with John Locke. We know John Locke, natural rights, the Enlightenment, and he tried to model the initial Carolina colony off of Enlightenment thought. So it had democratic institutions. It promoted social equality. Um, it actually had a ban on slavery initially too, which is kind of wild, especially if we think about South Carolina. Right, South Carolina is always causing trouble with slavery in the American colonial era, and then obviously in the run up to the Civil War. The Carolina colonies were free colonies initially, though obviously that changes. In the early 1700s, you actually see a split because South Carolina began to develop as a plantation based system with slaves, and North Carolina kind of remained small, more independent farmers. So they divided in 1719 into the two colonies that ultimately become the two states today. As we work our way down, or up rather, I should say, let's look at New Hampshire and Maine. Originally, New Hampshire and Maine were all kind of seen as ultimately going to be part of Massachusetts, but that doesn't happen. We know that that New Hampshire in particular was founded primarily by breakaway Puritans from the Massachusetts colonies. Anne Hutchison is the most famous person from New Hampshire. She had been cast out by Puritans because she wanted women to be able to be religious leaders in Puritanism, and the male elders had refused her. So she kind of branched off to her own version of Puritanism in New Hampshire, and her followers went with her. Rhode Island, we know that this is also a splinter off of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded by Roger Williams. He had been thrown out of Massachusetts, not because he wasn't Puritan, but because he wanted to have religious freedom. He wanted a secular government, church and state being separated. So the Puritans threw him out. So he went to Rhode Island, founded it, and the thing about Rhode Island that's unique is it is the only colony that had total religious freedom. It did not matter whether you were Catholic, Protestant, Christian, non-Christian. Everybody was welcome in Rhode Island. Now, as we get to some of the bigger ones, Pennsylvania, we know that was founded by the Quakers. I've heard the Quakers described as kind of like a much more relaxed version of Puritans. I don't think that's totally correct, but if it helps you kind of remember the relationship, they're kind of like a distant cousin of the Puritans. And so Quakers left Massachusetts. Same thing, persecution by the Puritans. Remember, the Puritans were strict, to say the least. William Penn founds it. He was actually a Quaker who had been a major source of loans to the English king, and the royal government, the crown, owed William Penn so much money that they said, "Look, we can't pay you. We don't have the money, so we're just going to give you Pennsylvania instead." So he was granted all of Pennsylvania as payment for the debts, and he goes on to found, the colony. He creates the Charter of Liberties. It is one of the only places that is not just religiously tolerant, but racially tolerant. You have a very diverse colony. He allows all of the other groups in the area to stay. He does not persecute them. As we work our way around, we know that New York was actually not originally an English colony. It was originally New Amsterdam. It was Dutch. And in 1664, the English basically conquer it. They take it over. New York has freedom of religion too, just because of how diverse it was. But there was a lot more tension in New York than there was in Rhode Island about that. New Jersey, if you remember from last year, New Jersey was actually originally part of New York. And then New York realized that they didn't want anything to do with New Jersey. They got sick of us, so they threw us out. Not exactly, but and so when New Jersey forms, it's another one of the more diverse colonies in the area. New Jersey had Dutch in it, English in it, Germans in it, even had Swedes in it. People from all over Europe had gone there. Not to mention also, obviously, the Native American population, some free Africans. There's a little bit of everybody in New Jersey, so it was a relatively diverse place. The one thing that was a little different, though, is that New Jersey had a pretty interesting kind of split. The northern half of New Jersey, basically like the Raritan River and up, looked a lot more like New York as a colony, and the southern half of New Jersey looked a lot more like Virginia as a colony. Connecticut, we know Connecticut was founded in the Hartford and New Haven colonies. They were not as free as Rhode Island in terms of religion, but it was a much more relaxed version of Puritanism, so there was a little bit more religious tolerance. And that really runs through the original colonies for the most part. So let's talk about things that they all had in common. The one thing that really all throughout the English colonies shared was an issue with, like, what are they going to do with their relationship with the Native Americans? Because even though all of the tribes were not necessarily the same, they all were there first, obviously. They all had tribal lands. And the English wanted the land. I mean, even the most tolerant places like Rhode Island, they still wanted land. So what were you going to do? And what we see is throughout the middle of the 1600s, the relationship between Native Americans and the colonies was one of what I like to think of as a kind of an option, where the English basically said you can civilize, you can be displaced, or you can be exterminated. And you saw the more tolerant colonies attempting to bring some Native Americans in and quote unquote civilize them. Some of the more aggressive colonies would just try to forcibly remove them, either through signing treaties or forced migration. And then in some places, you saw the colonists actively trying to exterminate the Native Americans. Think of it this way: the closer you get to the Appalachians, the more resistance you got as well. That kind of became the dividing line. So another thing that you saw practiced in all the colonies is what I like to call selective cooperation. When it suited the colonists' needs, they would work with the Native Americans to keep the peace. And once they had gained the upper hand, they would then immediately move to try to get rid of the Native Americans if possible. I think some of the more important conflicts to remember would be like the Pequot War in Connecticut and King Philip's War in kind of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. These two wars that kind of stretched from the 1630s all the way to the 1670s ultimately resulted in Native Americans being removed from pretty much all of New England, all right, and getting pushed farther and farther west. In particular, you saw a lot of extermination tactics here. In both wars, colonists would not think twice before destroying Native American communities, kind of forcing them to move west. In Jamestown, the Powhatan were eventually destroyed. And basically, throughout the 1600s, you saw this gradual push west of all the various Native American tribes in the region. The one that kind of held its own was the Iroquois, the five major Iroquois tribes. But beyond that, most Native Americans by the end of the 1600s had been pushed west of the Appalachian Mountains. Another thing that they all had in common is that they all fell under the not just control of England, but under the economic policy of mercantilism. You know that mercantilism is one of the biggest concepts of the time period. You should really know this well. In mercantilism, the concept is that there's a finite amount of wealth in the world. There's basically a total number that will never change. So you need to get as much as you can. So in mercantilism, colonies have to trade with the mother country. They will ship as much in terms of raw materials to the mother country as they can, and in exchange, the mother country will ship manufactured goods back to them. And the way the English enforced this was with the Navigation Acts, which said that only British ships could trade in British colonies. You could not be French or Dutch or Spanish. So the British created this kind of self-contained trade system using mercantilism. And it worked for the most part. The one thing that was kind of a downside for them was that does slow growth a little bit, but indentured servitude kind of offset that. And what we see is throughout the 1600s, basically 3 out of 4 people who came to the colonies were indentured servants. So they were bound to work for anywhere from 4 to 7 years, and in exchange they would eventually be granted land, and given a farm of their own and some tools and things to get started. So that was the main way you attracted people, is that if they put in some work for a few years, they could ultimately get their own land. And in Europe, remember, land was pretty much occupied by nobles at this point. Very few people got to be landowners. So being offered property in the Americas was kind of like winning a lotto, all right, a lotto ticket. So you saw a tremendous amount of the lower class going to the colonies because it gave them an opportunity to potentially rise socioeconomically in a way that they never would have been able to before. So let's talk about some of the social movements and things like that are going on in the colonies now. So let's start with women's roles in the colonies and kind of compare them to Europe, and talk a little bit about some of the similarities and differences, and then also the fact that when you look at gender norms and gender roles in like northern and southern colonies, you also see some differences. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, at least in the 16 and 1700s, is that relatively speaking, I mean, obviously, when we're talking about the 16 and 1700s, there's nothing near what I would call gender equality the way that we think of today. But relatively speaking, for the era, women in the Americas tended to have more independence, rights, freedoms, and even in some cases, like more forms of legal equality than they did in Europe. And a lot of that had to do with kind of conditions. So the mortality rate in the colonies was very high. And what you saw was there were a lot of like female heads of household, particularly down south where disease was a little more rampant. A lot of times, like, the husbands would die. There were lower birth rates in the colonies, at least initially, which led to a kind of a shift where like women with children had a little bit more kind of like social and almost like cultural authority as a result. And like I said, on the whole, women tended to have more rights and freedoms, relatively speaking, in the colonies than they did in Europe. But then even in the colonies, there were some different ideas. And the big split you could see is like North-South or New England versus South. So in the South, actually, which is another thing that I think is kind of surprising, the South, which we tend to not think of as the most culturally progressive place in the United States, or in the colonies, at least historically, in the South, women actually had more rights and freedoms relative to their northern counterparts during the colonial era. A lot of this had to do with some demographic issues. There were a lot more men than women in the South, and as a result, you saw, and that had a lot to do with like the colonies initially being populated by men. So women had some more kind of like social and like cultural capital as a result, in terms of like marriage and things like that. As I said, the mortality rates led to women being property owners in some cases. Though this gradually changes as the South becomes more established as kind of like the planter aristocracy that we think of in the run-up to the Civil War. In New England, you saw that Puritanism really had an impact. So women in New England still worked more. It was not uncommon for women to be in the workforce in northern colonies, which is obviously an increase in independence. But you saw a little bit more of like a traditional family structure kind of embedded due to, in a lot of ways, like that puritanical system. So when we look at slavery, which is the other really major kind of social and cultural development, as well as obviously legal and economic one, when we get into the mid 1600s through the mid 1700s, roughly 1640, 1650 to about 1750. This is the real big increase in slavery in the colonies. All right. So kind of a brief history before it gets to the United States, or the future United States. Slavery was really originally primarily in the Caribbean and in South America, at least like the Native American slavery, and then the like African, the triangle trade slavery, um, and it was primarily associated with the Portuguese and the Spanish initially. And as time goes on, and you see more and more demands for labor in North America, you see Bacon's Rebellion making things like indentured servitude fall out of favor, and you see a growth of cash crops, primarily tobacco. This all kind of comes together and starts to create a major like pull factor to create a more slave-based and racially based slave system in the South, and really in all the colonies initially. Um, by the middle of the 1700s, you had about 250,000 slaves in North America. We know that the conditions were terrible in the triangle trade with the Middle Passage. The death rate for slaves was enormous due to the treatment. That's sometimes kind of a misconception. They say, oh, African slaves were imported because they were more resistant to European diseases than Native Americans, and sometimes it's just left as that. And while that part is true, that doesn't mean that there wasn't like a high mortality rate. It basically meant that the cause of death tended to be overwork or other things, just as instead of disease. Um, so let's kind of get into how that developed in a little more detail. So by the late 1600s, as I said, there was this massive lack of labor, particularly in the South, and the indentured servitude system had kind of fallen out of favor. There was a land shortage. The Southerners couldn't keep giving land away to indentured servants. So what these like really wealthy planter elites, kind of the nobility of the colony, said was, how do we come up with a system that allows us to get our labor but doesn't force us to give land away at the end? They're trying to maintain power, and slavery becomes the way. Um, and what you see is that slavery begins to become racialized, kind of for the same reason. There was a recognition at Bacon's Rebellion that there were some freed slaves in the rebellion. And what the wealthy colonists basically make the decision to do is create a race-based system, because their hope was that you could divide the lower classes in society. If poor whites saw themselves as above slaves, the thought was they would be less likely to revolt because they still were not at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And it worked. There's no other way to put it. This is kind of how the system really gets codified into law. And then from there, you have a very elaborate system of cultural, social practices, and legal norms that get established. Slaves can have their families broken up. Slaves are not allowed to possess firearms. Slaves become physical property. Sometimes you hear it called chattel slavery. That's what that means, physical property. And what you see is that in a legal sense, by the 1700s, slaves in the colonies were treated very much the way that livestock was treated. And that was very intentional as a way to dehumanize the slaves, and to create this very separate race-based caste system. At the same time that this is happening, you see a huge influx in immigration and a lot of poor immigrants coming from Europe, which kind of reinforces the idea that they wanted to divide the lower groups in society up. The wealthy wanted to do that. For the first time by the early 1700s, we see non-English sources. You see French, Scotch-Irish, Germans, Scandinavians starting to come to the British colonies. And while the British restrict this a little bit, generally speaking, they allow a lot of people to come, which helps to bolster their numbers and continue to make the colonies successful. Remember, the colonies need to have a population that ultimately can be self-sustaining. So at first, you need a really large influx of immigrants. And what you see is that in the buildup of the 1700s until just after the French and Indian War, the colonial population increases almost tenfold. You go from about 250,000 people in the colonies total to about 2 million people in the colonies by the time you get to the eve of the American Revolution. Um, so part of this is also a part. Try that again. Part of this is also because of the way that the colonies developed economically. So in the same time period, you start to see the northern and southern colonies develop their own distinct economies, and then as a result, kind of their own distinct cultures too. Um, the South really begins to become known for cash crops in this period. Tobacco, obviously, being the biggest. But there were others too, things like indigo. Rice initially was seen as a cash crop because of how much food could be produced in a relatively small space. Um, and very quickly, this makes the southern colonies really conducive to not just slavery, but the big kind of plantations. You start to see less and less independent small farmers, and you start to see more and more of these massive, massive plantations controlled by families that look a lot like European nobles. Um, in the north, you start to see the beginnings of industry a little bit. Obviously, mining and subsistence agriculture are still big things, but the British start to permit some shops. There's a recognition, even with mercantilism, that in the mother country in England, not everything can be produced there. So you start to see a little bit of shipbuilding. You start to see some blacksmiths, some gunsmiths, some mills forming. Um, Nothing compared to their European counterparts, but the North at this point starts to become known as more of the merchant and industrial section of the colonies, with the South being the agricultural section, which we've kind of come to now know as the United States through the Civil War. Um, the British will cut down on this a little bit. We'll get into this more when we get to the lead up to the Revolution. But the British will start to restrict a lot of industry, and that ultimately is going to lead in a lot of ways to the rift that leads to the Revolution. Um, the triangle trade is a big part of this, and in a lot of ways, the triangle trade is what holds the northern and southern colonies together. You see the north kind of being the source of a lot of the shipping, and northern merchants will ship things back and forth both to the mother country, England, as well as to Africa. We know that guns, liquor, molasses, things like that were given to African like tribal chiefs, and then in exchange they would trade for slaves captured from other tribes. So this trade really kind of whips up tribal warfare in Africa. A lot of times the slaves then went to the Caribbean first, and then you would see a second kind of leg of the trade where slaves and other manufactured goods would be traded for each other and then brought to the colonies, the 13 colonies. Um, and what this starts to get us into is kind of the build up to the French and Indian War, which is where we break this period. So the other thing you know that's happening once we get into the early 1700s is you have the First Great Awakening as well as the Enlightenment. And what these have a combination of doing is the First Great Awakening starts to create a little bit more religious diversity. You start to see a breaking of the old traditional kind of Puritan system. Um, and more religious independence. And remember, religion was a central part of daily life for almost everybody in the colonies. So when you see religious reform, you often see social reform too. We tend to not think of religion as a driver of like social change today, but it was one in the colonial era. And when you couple that with the Enlightenment, which you guys know about from from earlier classes, and Gittes probably talked about it a little bit too, is you start to see more and more talk about democracy and individual rights and freedoms. And what all this does is this starts to create a kind of legal identity in the colonies that's different from Europe as well. Um, the British used a policy, which I'm sure you guys remember the term. It's called salutary neglect, which basically said we're going to let the colonies kind of handle their own business on a day-to-day basis. It's just easier. Um, Remember, travel and news does not spread quickly because of the time period. So it was really impractical for the British Crown to rule the colonies on a day-to-day basis. So they kind of oversaw like general policy, and the colonies used their own colonial governments for the rest. And so the colonial government started to develop into really kind of precursors to our democratic system in the United States. And what that did was that started to make the colonies feel like they were, at least to a degree, politically independent. which obviously we know is going to lead to the revolution. Um, and as you work your way towards the 1750s, um, you start to see the English kind of build into this. For example, the Parliament will actually relax the Navigation Acts, which had been designed to enforce mercantilism. You'll see that the colonial governors that were appointed by the crown typically made colonial kind of employees, like lower level colonial residents, do the job for them. A lot of the colonial governors never actually like went to the colonies; they just stayed in England and collected a check. Um, so more and more, the colonies, by the time you get to 1754 and the beginning of the French and Indian War, the colonies are starting to look at themselves as kind of unique, almost like city states. You know, they see themselves as separate from England to a degree, but the 13 colonies also see themselves as separate from each other. Um, okay, so why don't we stop there? That's a good kind of break point. Good introduction, and like the last time, now what you'll want to do is you'll want to review your notes. You'll want to use your AP review guides that you guys hopefully have at this point, and do a little bit of studying of 1607 to 1754, and you'll do that for a day. And then we will do some more practice questions. This is going to be a more in-depth section than Unit 1, Period 1. And that's really what the big topic's going to be this week, is kind of breaking through this period as we work our way towards like Wednesday and Thursday coming up. So hope that was useful as an intro and kind of a refresher. And good luck with your studying. And then we will talk on Monday about kind of starting to get into this in a little more depth for review. So have a good weekend, and I will talk to you guys soon.